Chances are if you click this video, you're either on your way to building an emergency fund or maybe you already have an emergency fund. Now, there's a large range on how much an emergency fund people think you should have, going all the way down from 2 to 3 months, all the way up to even 12 months. And not only am I going to emphasize the importance of having an emergency fund, but I'm going to go more into detail on when you should either lean more towards having 2 to 3 months of an emergency fund, or how this is calculated in general and how you can get up all the way to 6 months or even 12 months in some cases. So I'll start with some stats to emphasize why one would need an emergency fund. And while I don't necessarily recommend comparing yourself to others, I do think it can be used as a helpful gauge. So according to data from GoBanking Rates, around 70% of Americans have less than $1,000 in savings, and 45% of Americans have nothing in their savings. And this data is similar to other findings, like this breakdown of amounts saved between men and women, and you see that about 50% of men and 60% of women have less than $1,000 saved. So even regardless of the differences between these different studies, it's pretty safe to assume that at least 50% of Americans have, less than $1,000 saved, and that at least 1 in 4 Americans have, absolutely no savings. So if you just took, you and a group of 3 friends, there's a good chance that at least one of you in that group has absolutely no savings. Now, to jump into how much someone needs for an emergency fund, the general consensus is between 3 months of expenses to 6 months of expenses. And while I do generally agree with that sentiment, I don't necessarily think it gives enough detail on why someone should have 3 months of expenses versus why some people should have 6 months of expenses. But before I go into any more detail, if you appreciate this video, please give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate it a lot. So really all this comes down to is your risk tolerance and your job security. A study done just 2 years ago of over 2,000 people found that on average, it took approximately 5 months to find a job, which would include the time spent being rejected to the actual hiring process of that final company. And even just consider this stat, that if you apply today and that company were to eventually hire you, it would still take 9 weeks from the day that the company received the application to the actual first day on the job. So this begins to explain on why someone would need 3 to 6 months of expenses without having to go into debt, which I'll touch more in a second. So to calculate for your own self on how much you need for expenses, the best thing to do is kind of take an average as far as the past 3 months of expenses, how much you're paying on necessities. So these want to include things like, subscriptions to Netflix or, buying clothes or eating out, because when it really came down to it, if you lost your job and you really had to tighten your budget, those are things that you could probably actually sacrifice. But the necessities would include things like housing, food, utilities, paying certain debts, also transportation. So like I said, you could take an average of the previous 3 months, but another way to approach this is you could actually take the highest month of expenses if you want to take a more conservative approach. So let's just say it ends up being $1,000 per month, then you multiply that times the amount of months that you want to have a savings for. Now I'm going to share my personal experience on when you should lean more towards 3 months versus when you should lean more towards 6 months. When I was younger, I didn't have anybody that was relying on me for, food or source of income. I didn't necessarily mind if I had to crash on a friend's couch for a little while, and I didn't mind if I had to eat ramen day after day after day. And the economy was pretty strong at the time, so it made sense to kind of have a smaller emergency savings around 3 months. But let's say I had people that were relying on me, or like now I have a home, so if I miss a home payment, that's putting me at risk of losing the home, losing the equity on the home, or, affecting my credit score. So those are all things where the risk factors are more important. So those are times where I may want to shift more towards 6 months, or where the economy is more shaky, or maybe you have multiple kids relying on you. Those are times, once again, where you start to add more months because, kids aren't going to be wanting to eat ramen day after day. Maybe some kids, but, not most. Or another example would be if, for example, you're dual income. If you're 2 single people living in the same household, the odds that both people are going to lose a job simultaneously is not as likely as one person losing their job. So if one person loses their job, the other person and their source of income can hold you over for a little while. So that's maybe a time where you might want to start shifting from 5 months of an emergency fund down to 3 months of an emergency fund. So in the end, all of this relates to basically just these different risk factors that you may have. You think about what aspects of your life are very secure and what aspects of your life you can't really risk. And so kind of the last piece in all of this is job security. For example, if you're working something that requires commission, for example, you're working in real estate, for example, then your income is not necessarily as stable. So, you could go a period of 3 months to 6 months of not having a sale. And so those are times where you may want to increase your emergency fund to like 6 months. But let's say, for example, you're an accountant at a well-established company and you also happen to live in a geographic area where there's a huge demand for an accountant. And so then what happens is, even if you lost your job, you'd probably pretty quickly find a new job. And in that case, instead of having 6 months of an emergency fund, you begin to shift it down to 4 months or even 3 months. So in the end, it's kind of just dependent on your own risk tolerance and your job security. So to be as transparent as possible, for me personally, I tend to go with about 4 months worth of expenses, but that's because I live, in a dual income household with no kids, and we both tend to work jobs that, are very job secure and stable. So we're not necessarily worried about losing our jobs at the same time. And then, you can have money set aside elsewhere as well, and I highly recommend that you get to that point. But, you need the emergency fund to be in a situation where it's as liquid as possible, which just means that you can withdraw it as quickly as possible, because if you need that money tomorrow and you got laid off, that money's available for you versus, investing in 401k or real estate, those types of things. Those don't necessarily count as an emergency fund. Now, the last point I want to make is the cost of not having an emergency fund. For example, if you're trying to fund an emergency fund that was $1,000, that would be about $85 per month or $20 per week to be able to fund that $1,000 within a year. But let's say you used $1,000 on a credit card and that was your emergency fund. A credit card interest rate can be anywhere from 18 to 22%. So to actually take, you can use a debt payment calculator to verify this, but it would actually take an additional 2 months. It would take a year and 2 months to be able to pay that $1,000 back. Plus, you would end up paying $135 towards that interest. So that's money that just kind of went down the drain. So in the end, I'm trying to get you to realize that, it's the same $85 per month. But if you just did that preemptively, then it would save you $135 within a year. So I know it can seem very difficult to do to initially fund that emergency fund, but it is something that you have to do because, life is not necessarily going to get magically better on its own. So if things are really difficult now, it will only get more difficult down the road. So it's definitely something I encourage people to do, even if that means taking like side jobs. I just did a video recently on just 5 ideas that I gave for side gigs that you could probably do pretty easily without any, requirements as far as education or anything like that. So check that out if you want. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you like anything personal finance or business related, I post a video pretty much every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and sometimes Saturdays as well. So please hit that subscribe button to stay tuned for more.